Margaret Evelyn Holloway had not missed a single Christmas in 72 years. Not one. Even the year her husband Thomas died, when the house still smelled faintly of hospital antiseptic and grief sat heavy on her chest like a weight, she wrapped gifts with trembling hands and baked cinnamon bread through tears. Christmas, to Margaret, was not a holiday. It was a promise she had kept for decades. The journey. That Christmas morning, Margaret stood in her small but spotless living room, coat buttoned neatly, scarf folded just so. Outside, frost clung to the windows of her modest suburban home. At least, that's what everyone called it. The house had been paid off for over 40 years. No one ever asked how. On the dining table sat 3 neatly wrapped handmade gifts, each tied with twine and a small pine sprig she had clipped from her backyard. Beside them were 3 envelopes, thick, labeled carefully in her looping handwriting. For Emily and Mark, for Jason, for the kids. Inside each envelope was cash, just like every year, enough to help with bills, presents, or unexpected expenses. Margaret never asked how it was spent. She just gave. She always gave. Margaret picked up the gifts, her hands slightly arthritic but steady. She took one last look around the room, the crocheted blanket she'd made after Thomas passed, the framed photos of her children in graduation gowns she'd paid for, weddings she'd funded, houses she'd quietly helped secure. Then she locked the door behind her. The daughter's house. Emily's house was loud before Margaret even rang the bell. Laughter, music, phones buzzing, someone shouting about coffee. Margaret adjusted her scarf and smiled to herself. They're happy, she thought. That's all that matters. The door flew open. "Oh, Mom," Emily said, her smile just a fraction late. "You made it." Margaret stepped inside, immediately hit with warmth and something else. Expectation. Not the loving kind, the kind that weighed. "Let me take those," Emily said, already reaching for the gifts. "Oh, no, dear," Margaret laughed softly. "I can manage." From the living room, Jason called out, "Grandma's here. Everyone acts surprised." Laughter erupted. Margaret paused, just for a second. Then she smiled again and walked in. The atmosphere. Phones were already out. Her grandchildren barely looked up from their screens. Mark nodded politely. "Hey, Margaret." No hugs, no kisses on the cheek, no "we're so glad you're here." Margaret placed the gifts carefully under the tree. She handed Emily the envelopes last. Emily didn't open them immediately. She weighed them in her hand, eyes flicking briefly to Mark. Margaret noticed. She always noticed. Dinner without warmth. Dinner passed strangely. Margaret complimented the food. No one asked if she needed anything. When she mentioned her drive had been long, Emily sighed. "Well, you did insist on coming yourself." Margaret chuckled politely. "I didn't want to bother anyone." Jason muttered under his breath, "Wouldn't want to bother us." Mark snorted. Margaret pretended not to hear, but something inside her shifted, just slightly. "We got you something." After dinner, Emily clapped her hands. "Okay, gifts. And Mom, we actually did something different this year." Margaret's eyes lit up like a child's. "Oh?" Emily gestured dramatically. "This year, we all went in together." Jason raised his phone higher. "Smile, Grandma." Margaret laughed nervously and straightened her posture. Emily handed her a gift bag. Inside was a cheap ceramic mug, white, thin, light. Printed on it in bold black letters, "World's Okayest Grandma." The room erupted in laughter. Margaret blinked. Once, twice. "Oh," she said softly, "that's sweet." Emily reached back into the bag. "Wait, there's more." She pulled out a card. Jason zoomed in with his phone. Emily cleared her throat dramatically and read aloud. Dear Mom, since you've basically moved in here every Christmas, we figured you'd appreciate something practical. Thanks for being our favorite long-term guest, aka freeloader. Love, your family. Silence. Then laughter, loud, cruel, unfiltered. The moment that changed everything. Margaret stared at... Margaret didn't cry on the drive home. That surprised even her. The radio played soft Christmas music, songs she used to hum while baking cookies for children who now laughed at her discomfort. Snow drifted lazily across the windshield, and the road was nearly empty. Her hands stayed steady on the steering wheel. Her face stayed calm. But inside her chest, something ancient cracked open. Alone again. The house greeted her with silence. Not the lonely kind, the honest kind. Margaret hung her coat carefully. She placed the cheap mug on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. World's Okayest Grandma. She picked it up, turned it over. The glaze was uneven. The handle felt thin, fragile, like it would crack under pressure. She laughed once, a quiet, humorless sound. "Well," she whispered, "at least they're honest." She placed the mug upside down in the sink and turned away. The drawer. Margaret walked into her bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of her dresser. Inside, beneath folded scarves and old photo albums, was a small lockbox. She hadn't opened it in years. Her fingers hesitated over the latch, then clicked. Inside were documents neatly stacked and labeled in Thomas's handwriting. Life insurance policy, investment accounts, property deeds, updated valuations. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled slowly. She remembered the day Thomas had insisted. "Promise me something," he'd said, voice weak but eyes sharp. "Don't tell them, not unless you have to." She laughed then. "Why would I ever have to?" Thomas had smiled sadly. The numbers. Margaret unfolded the most recent statement. Her breath caught, not from shock, but from certainty. She already knew. Between investments, properties, and compounded growth, the total sat comfortably in the 8 figures. More money than her children could imagine, more money than they had ever thanked her for. Margaret closed the folder gently. "They never loved me," she whispered. "They loved what I gave." The morning after. The next morning, Margaret woke early. She made tea, fed the birds outside. Then she did something she had never done before. She logged into her bank account. The silent decision. There were monthly transfers scheduled. Emily, house help. Jason, just in case. Mark, business support. Margaret stared at the list. No anger, no shaking hands, just resolve. One by one, she canceled them. No explanation, no warning. She clicked confirm. The first call. It took less than 4 hours. Her phone rang. Emily. Margaret let it ring. Then again, and again. Finally, a text. "Mom, did something happen with the bank?" Margaret sipped her tea. No reply. Jason's panic. That afternoon, Jason called. Straight to voicemail. Then Mark, then Emily again, this time more frantic. "Mom, this isn't funny. My payment didn't come through." Margaret finally responded. One message, short, polite. "I've decided to simplify my finances. Everything is fine." She set the phone down. Her hands were still steady. The mug's final use. That evening, Margaret poured herself coffee. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. She used the mug. As she lifted it, the handle snapped clean off. Coffee spilled across the counter. Margaret stared at the ceramic broken. Then she laughed, loudly. The will. 2 days later, Margaret sat in a quiet law office. The lawyer, a calm woman with silver hair, glanced over her glasses. "You're sure?" Margaret nodded. "Very." The lawyer hesitated. "No family beneficiaries?" Margaret smiled gently. "I've given enough." She listed them carefully. 3 animal shelters, 1 scholarship fund, a community food bank, and finally, "A trust," Margaret said, "for myself." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. The beach house arrival. Margaret's plane touched down in Florida on a chilly, early January morning. The beach stretched endlessly before her. The sun glinted off the waves like scattered gold. Seagulls wheeled overhead. The salty breeze carried the scent of freedom, fresh and bracing. Margaret stepped off the plane with only a single suitcase. Her modest home, her old life, her children's scorn, it all felt like it belonged to someone else. She hired a cab to the beach house she had quietly purchased months earlier, long before any of her children knew she was even considering leaving. The house was modern, airy, and serene, perched on a dune overlooking the water. Large windows framed the horizon, letting in the morning sun. Margaret set down her suitcase, walked barefoot to the deck, and let the sound of waves wash over her. For the first time in decades, she felt untethered. The family's realization. Back home, Emily sat at the kitchen table scrolling through her emails when a notice popped up. "Property sale complete. Transfer of ownership confirmed." Emily froze. Her hands trembled. Jason read over her shoulder. "What? She sold it?" Jason whispered. Emily shook her head. "No, this wasn't a joke." Mark barged in. "She what? Mom sold the house?" Emily handed him the email. He scanned it, face paling. The house, their childhood home, had sold for over $3 million. They had never suspected a thing. They had assumed the modest home meant modest wealth. Their mother had been playing a quiet, secret game all along. Panic set in. The calls started immediately. Emily called, begging for explanations. Jason texted, furious. Mark threatened legal action, hoping a technicality might reverse the sale. Margaret did not respond. She didn't need to. Every attempt they made, she ignored. For the first time, they were powerless. Margaret's first morning of freedom. Sunrise painted the sky in shades of rose and lavender. Margaret walked along the beach, letting her toes sink into soft, wet sand. She thought of the mug, the card, the cruel laughter, and she laughed softly to herself, not bitterly, not angrily, but with delighted satisfaction. She brewed fresh coffee, this time in a ceramic mug she had picked herself. She watched pelicans skim the water, the horizon stretching endlessly. The world felt her own for the first time in 72 years. The donations began. Margaret spent the next week making quiet, significant contributions to the charities in her new will. Animal shelters that had long struggled to stay open received funds to expand and renovate. Scholarship funds for underprivileged children were established in her late husband's name. Community food banks, local clinics, and small libraries were all quietly empowered. She did all of this anonymously, no press releases, no fanfare, just impact. The first attempt at contact. Emily tried again. "Mom, we just want to talk. Can you please explain?" Margaret paused over the text. She typed a single reply. "I have explained everything through my actions. I am living my life now. Please respect that." She deleted the message before sending it. She didn't want conflict. She wanted peace. The family's gossip. By the end of the month, word had spread quietly among their social circles. "Margaret Holloway sold her house in Florida?" one neighbor whispered. "She's retired, and no one in her family even knows where she is," said another. "Can you believe she had millions all along?" someone muttered. Their children, however, were the most humiliated. Friends and colleagues began hinting at their dependence on Margaret, highlighting how little gratitude they had shown. Every whispered comment, every awkward glance reminded them how blind they had been. Margaret meets the locals. Life on the beach was strangely comforting. Margaret began introducing herself to her neighbors, not as Grandma, not as the woman. A new dawn. Morning broke over the Florida coast like a promise. Golden sunlight spilled across the sand, and the waves glimmered as if applauding. Margaret walked along the shoreline, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand. She carried no burdens today, no insults, no obligations, no pretense. Her phone buzzed constantly, Emily, Jason, Mark, but she ignored them all. Instead, she focused on herself. The first purchase. Margaret treated herself to a little indulgence she had always denied, a small art studio in town. She filled it with canvases, paints, and brushes. She painted for herself, not for anyone else. Her art was messy, vibrant, free. For the first time, every brushstroke reflected her own desires. No one else's approval mattered. The charity gala. A local animal shelter invited her to their winter gala. Margaret arrived not as a donor, but as a visionary benefactor. Guests whispered, media captured photos. "You've done so much for the community," a reporter said. "I've done what felt right," Margaret replied, smiling quietly. It was the first time she realized her actions, not her family's recognition, had real impact. Her heart swelled with a joy they could never take away. The family's escalation. Back home, the children grew desperate. Emily hired a lawyer, hoping to contest the house sale. Jason posted social media rants, trying to shame her publicly. Mark called distant relatives, seeking sympathy or leverage. But Margaret had prepared for this quietly and meticulously. All her assets were legally secured, her will was ironclad, and her reputation unassailable. They were powerless. The moment of revelation. 2 months later, Margaret allowed herself a little theatricality. She sent a holiday card, simple, elegant, to Emily, Jason, and Mark. Inside was a short message. "I hope your holidays are as joyful as mine. Remember, generosity should never be mistaken for weakness." No signatures, no fanfare, just truth. The family, for the first time, understood fully the woman they mocked, humiliated, and took for granted was far more capable, wealthy, and independent than they had ever imagined. Margaret's beach life. The winter passed, and Margaret's days settled into blissful routine. Sunrise walks on the beach, painting in her studio, volunteering at shelters, hosting intimate dinners for new friends. She bought a small sailboat and learned to navigate the gentle currents, laughing as she tumbled into the waves during her first solo attempt. Every day reminded her of one truth: freedom tastes sweeter than fear, and dignity is priceless. The final closure. Emily, Jason, and Mark eventually visited Florida, cautiously, sheepishly. Margaret welcomed them, not with anger, not with spite, but with calm authority. "You mocked me.
You laughed at me, you filmed my pain, but I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." They hung their heads, they apologized. Margaret accepted the apologies politely, but she knew she no longer needed them. Her life was hers, and no humiliation could ever touch her again. The legacy. Margaret's story spread quietly, inspiring neighbors, friends, and eventually media outlets. Animal shelters flourished, children's scholarships changed lives, communities benefited from her generosity. Yet through it all, Margaret remained humble. She no longer gave for recognition, she gave because it felt right. Her legacy was clear. Wealth is not measured in dollars, but in dignity, kindness, and the courage to walk away from those who take you for granted. The final scene.